Hello, friends. This is the first episode, How to Animate a Stickman as a beginner like me, until you guys see it like a professional editor. Okay, I'm serious.
Have you ever met someone who leaves you feeling energized after a conversation? You walk away thinking, that was such a good interaction. And then, if you replay it in your head, you realize something strange. They didn't actually spend much time talking about themselves. That wasn't luck. That was skill. There's a hidden formula behind memorable conversations, and one of the strongest parts of it is the quality of your questions. Most of us say we want deeper relationships, but when we talk to people, we often do the opposite of what creates depth. We wait for our turn. We plan what we're going to say next. We look for openings to tell our own story. It's like going to a dinner party and spending the whole night showing everyone pictures of meals you've cooked instead of tasting what's already on the table. Here's what matters. The human brain is wired to bond with people who show sincere curiosity. When someone asks you thoughtful, relevant questions and actually listens, your brain interprets that as significance. It feels safe. It feels validating. It feels connecting. In other words, questions aren't just a social trick. They're one of the fastest ways to create real rapport. That changes how we should think about conversation. The goal isn't to be endlessly impressive. The goal is to be deeply interested. Questions are what separate forgettable interactions from conversations people remember. They can change how someone experiences you without requiring you to become louder, smarter, or more entertaining. Think about the last person who asked about something that genuinely mattered to you, your goals, your interests, your work, your weekend, and then listened like the answer actually mattered. How did you feel around them afterward? That feeling is the effect you can create for other people when you learn how to ask better questions. Chapter 1. Why some people stay in your mind. Your brain is constantly sorting through information, deciding what deserves attention and what can be discarded. One of the strongest criteria it uses is emotional relevance. When someone asks you a question that makes you feel understood, noticed, or appreciated, your brain tags that moment as meaningful. It doesn't file that interaction under random small talk. It stores it under this mattered. That's why people tend to remember those who make them feel seen. Strong questions create that feeling. They make people feel interesting. They make people feel valued. They make people feel understood. And that means you can become memorable without dominating the conversation or listing your accomplishments. You could spend 10 minutes explaining why you're impressive. Or you could ask one question that makes the other person feel genuinely understood. One of those approaches builds a much stronger emotional imprint, and it's not the one most people spend their time practicing. It's actually kind of funny. We obsess over how to present ourselves well, when the real secret to being remembered often has less to do with talking about ourselves and more to do with drawing other people out. There's another psychological principle at work here too. Curiosity loves an open loop. When you ask a compelling question, you create a small unresolved space in the other person's mind. Their brain wants to complete it by exploring the answer. That naturally increases engagement. So when you learn to ask better questions, you're not just being social. You're working with the way memory, attention, and connection actually function. That's a powerful skill. Chapter 2. The kind of question changes the kind of connection. Not all questions do the same job. The form of the question shapes how far the conversation can go. Closed questions usually invite short answers. Did you have a nice weekend? Do you like your job? Have you been there before? Those questions aren't bad, but they don't give the other person much room to open up. They tend to shut the conversation down almost as soon as it starts. Open questions do the opposite. They invite stories, perspective, reflection, and detail. Compare these. What was the best part of your weekend? What do you enjoy most about your work? What stood out to you about that experience? Now there's room for an actual conversation. It's the difference between offering someone a bite-sized snack and handing them a full meal. One gives them almost nothing to work with. The other gives them space to share. A simple way to improve almost any question is to change how you start it. Instead of leading with did, do, or have you, try beginning with what, how, in what way. That one shift can turn a flat question into one people actually want to answer. So why don't we do it more often? Because closed questions feel safer. They ask less of both people, less vulnerability, less uncertainty, less exposure. But connection usually doesn't happen in the safe zone. It happens when there's enough room for someone to reveal something real. Another easy upgrade is flipping I statements into curiosity. Instead of, I've been to that restaurant. I love that book too. I've done something similar. Try, what did you think of the restaurant? What connected with you in that book? What was that experience like for you? That subtle shift changes the energy of the interaction. It tells the other person, I'm not just waiting to insert myself here. I actually want your perspective. And that signal is far more memorable than most people realize. Chapter 3. The missing skill that breaks most conversations. A lot of conversations don't fail because the first question was bad. They fail because there was no second question. Follow-ups are where connection actually deepens. Research has shown that people who ask follow-up questions tend to be liked more. And it makes sense. When you follow up on something a person just shared, you're showing that you weren't just performing politeness. You were paying attention. Most people ask one decent question, hear the answer, and then immediately swing the spotlight back to themselves. That's where the momentum dies. The first question opens the conversation. The follow-up is what actually walks through it. When someone answers you, they're giving you clues. They're highlighting what matters to them. Every detail they emphasize is a breadcrumb saying, this part is important to me. Good follow-up questions notice those breadcrumbs and keep going. For example, imagine you ask, how was your weekend? And the person says, pretty good. I finally checked out this hiking trail I'd been wanting to do. A self-focused response would be, oh nice, I went hiking a few weeks ago too. A connection-building response would be, what made you want to try that trail? What do you like most about hiking? Was it what you expected? The difference sounds small. The effect isn't. One response redirects the conversation back to you. The other tells them, I'm interested in understanding your world. And here's the irony. The person who spends more time drawing the other person out is often the one remembered as the better conversationalist. That's because follow-up questions shift you from sounding like someone who's interviewing to someone who's actually connecting. People can feel the difference. Chapter 4. The 70-30 Conversation Rule. There's a simple ratio that can dramatically improve the quality of your conversations. Aim for the other person to do roughly 70% of the talking, while you do about 30%. At first, that might sound excessive, especially if you've been taught that being charismatic means being witty, impressive, and full of stories. But the most magnetic people usually understand something else. People respond more strongly to feeling interesting than to meeting someone who's trying hard to seem interesting. The 70-30 rule doesn't mean becoming silent or robotic. It doesn't mean turning into a detective with a clipboard. It simply means placing more of the conversational spotlight on the other person. Most people assume the point of a conversation is to show how smart, experienced, funny, or knowledgeable they are. In reality, that strategy often backfires. People may forget the details of what you said. They're far less likely to forget how they felt in your presence. And few things feel better than being fully heard. When someone has room to talk about something they care about and you stay engaged, they feel important. They feel respected. They feel seen. And those feelings become attached to you. That's why the 70-30 rule works. It creates a kind of emotional safety. It gives the other person permission to expand rather than perform. And when someone feels good while talking to you, they're more likely to want to talk to you again. Ironically, speaking less often makes you seem more compelling, not less. It creates curiosity. It leaves space. It makes people want to know more about you rather than feel overwhelmed by how much you've already told them. Chapter 5. Questions that make people feel safe enough to be real. The strongest questions don't just get answers. They create safety. Psychologists call this psychological safety, the feeling that you can be honest without being punished, judged, or embarrassed for it. When your questions create that feeling, people open up differently. The conversation moves beyond polite surface talk and into something more real. One useful technique is softening a sensitive question before you ask it. Instead of, "Why did you leave your last job?" You might say, "If you're open to sharing, I'd be curious what led to that career change." That small adjustment matters. It signals respect. It acknowledges that the topic may be personal, and it gives the other person an easy exit if they'd rather not go there. Another technique is offering a small piece of your own vulnerability first. For example, "My first year after college was a harder transition than I expected. What was that period like for you?" Why does that work? Because vulnerability tends to invite vulnerability. When you show a little honesty first, the other person often feels safer doing the same. There's something ironic here. Everyone wants to feel safe, but we don't always think about how to create safety for other people. We're so busy worrying about being judged that we forget the person in front of us is probably carrying the same fear. Questions that validate before they probe can help enormously. For example, "That sounds like it was a tough experience. How did you handle it?" "That's an interesting decision. What led you there?" "That seems like a big shift. What was that like for you?" Validation lowers defensiveness. It tells the other person, "I'm not here to judge your answer. I'm here to understand it." And that changes everything. Chapter 6. Ask the right question at the right time. Even a great question can miss if the timing is wrong. Part of asking well is learning how to read the room. Before you ask something deeper, pay attention to the person's state. Do they seem relaxed, present, open? Or do they seem rushed, distracted, drained, or emotionally preoccupied? Your question should fit the moment. If someone is stressed and trying to get out the door, a deep reflective question may feel intrusive rather than thoughtful. If someone is calm, engaged, and in a reflective mood, shallow questions may feel flat and unsatisfying. Most of us have asked a tone-deaf question at some point, bringing up dating right after a breakup, asking about work when someone is clearly overwhelmed, or trying to force depth when the other person isn't ready. Reading the room helps you avoid that. Non-verbal signals tell you a lot. Folded arms short answers, weak eye contact, distracted body language. Those are often signs to keep things lighter or slower. On the other hand, if someone is leaning in, elaborating on their answers, holding eye contact, and responding with energy, that's usually an invitation to go a little deeper. Context matters too. What's appropriate in one setting may feel strange in another. A networking event calls for a different kind of curiosity than a one-on-one coffee. Group conversations usually call for lighter questions than private ones. And cultural norms can change the line between curious and too personal, more than people realize. A useful rule is this: the less familiarity and trust there is, the easier the question should be to answer. As trust grows, depth can grow with it. Chapter 7. How to move beyond small talk without making it weird. Small talk gets criticized a lot, but it actually has a purpose. It's a warm-up. It helps people settle in. The problem isn't small talk itself. The problem is never leaving it. You can think of conversation as moving through different layers. A simple version of those layers might look like this: pleasantries and cliches, facts and surface updates, opinions and preferences, feelings and personal experiences, hopes, values, fears, and deeper motivations. Most conversations stay in the first two levels. Real connection usually starts to happen at levels 4 and 5. The key is not to jump there awkwardly. It's to transition naturally. That's where good questions matter. You might begin with, "How's your week been?" Then move to, "What's been taking up most of your time lately?" Then, "What part of that has been most engaging for you?" Then, "How did you first realize that mattered to you?" And eventually, where do you hope that leads in the future? Each question builds on the last one. That makes the conversation deepen gradually instead of feeling forced. Here's something people often don't realize. A lot of people are relieved when a conversation finally moves past small talk. We cling to surface level exchanges because they feel safe, but they are often unsatisfying for everyone involved. The trick is choosing deeper questions that are meaningful without being invasive. Topics like values, lessons, enjoyment, purpose, or changing perspectives tend to work well. Questions like, "What's been bringing you a lot of joy lately?" "What's something you've changed your mind about in the past few years?" "What have you been learning about yourself recently?" Most people are starving for something more real than social autopilot. The person who knows how to ask nourishing questions stands out immediately. Chapter 8. Asking better questions. Online. Questions matter even more in digital communication. When you're talking through text, email, or video, you lose a lot of the cues that normally guide a conversation. Facial expressions, body language, energy shifts, tone adjustments, timing. That means your questions have to do more of the work. Digital communication comes with its own problems. Tone gets misread. Messages can feel abrupt. It's harder to build rhythm fatigue sets in quickly, especially on video. So the questions you ask need to compensate for what's missing. They should add context. They should create clarity. They should help establish emotional tone. In text, for example, a question that sounds perfectly fine in person can feel sharp or interrogative on a screen. Softening your wording becomes more important. Compare. "What do you think?" with "I'd love to hear your thoughts on this." The second one feels warmer and less abrupt. Video calls create a different challenge. They feel like in-person interaction, but without many of the benefits of actually being in the same room. People get tired more quickly, and conversational cues are harder to read. Open-ended questions can help because they reduce the choppy back and forth and make the conversation flow more naturally. One of the most useful digital habits is the check-in question. Before diving into the main topic, ask something like, "How's your energy today?" "How has your week been going so far?" "What kind of headspace are you in today?" Those questions provide context that would normally be obvious if you were physically together. You can also use questions to recreate the meta conversation we naturally do in person. Does this feel like the right direction to take this? Would it be useful to go deeper on that part? Do you want to stay with this topic or shift? The internet makes it easy for people to hide behind polished surfaces. At the same time, it often makes them crave authenticity even more. That's why good questions can create surprisingly real moments online. sometimes in places where almost everything else feels shallow. Chapter 9. The questions that push people away. Knowing what to ask matters. Knowing what not to ask matters just as much. Some questions create openness, others create tension, defensiveness, or distance, even if you didn't mean them that way. One category to watch out for is questions that make people feel they have to defend themselves. These often begin with why. For example, why would you choose that job? Why didn't you just do this instead? Even if your intention is harmless, why can easily sound like a challenge rather than curiosity. It can make people feel like they need to justify themselves. Often, a better move is to replace why with what or how. What drew you to that field? How did you approach that decision? What was going through your mind when you chose that? Another type to avoid is the hidden agenda question, the kind that pretends to ask but is actually delivering an opinion or judgment. Examples: don't you think that's a bit risky? Wouldn't a more stable option make more sense? Are you sure that's a good idea? Those aren't really questions, they're critiques wearing a question mark. People can usually feel that immediately, and it creates distance fast. Leading questions can cause similar problems. These are questions that smuggle in an assumption about how the other person feels. You must have been exhausted, right? That had to be frustrating, didn't it? Even if your guess is correct, it can feel constraining. It removes the other person's freedom to describe their own experience in their own words. There's also question stacking, asking 3 or 4 questions before the person has had time to answer the first one. It overloads them and makes it harder to respond honestly. One thoughtful question at a time, with space to answer fully, is almost always better than a rapid-fire list. And here's one of the most important points in the entire conversation toolkit. Sometimes the best question is no question at all. Sometimes what the moment calls for is silence, or a reflective comment, or a simple supportive response. Knowing when not to ask is part of conversational intelligence too. Chapter 10, Your Question Toolkit. We've covered a lot, so let's turn it into something practical. If you want to build stronger conversations right away, it helps to have a small toolkit of question types you can reach for. 1. Opening questions. These help create comfort while leaving room for the conversation to go deeper. Examples: what's been on your mind lately? What are you excited about right now? What's been taking up most of your energy recently? These work because they're open without being too invasive. 2. Follow-up questions. This is where the real connection happens. Examples: what was that like for you? How did that affect the way you see things? What did you take away from that experience? What part of that mattered most to you? These questions signal that you're not just hearing the words, you're trying to understand the meaning behind them. 3. Safety-building questions. These help people feel more comfortable being honest. Examples: if you're comfortable sharing, I'd love to hear your perspective. I'm curious how you see that. What's your take on it? Only if you want to talk about it. What was that experience like? The point here is not to pressure, it's to create space. 4. Reflective questions. These show that you're actually listening and tracking what matters. Examples: it sounds like that was a turning point for you. So, if I'm hearing you right, that really changed your perspective? It seems like that mattered more than the outcome itself. Is that right? These responses tell the other person, I'm not just waiting to speak, I'm trying to understand you accurately. But here's the most important part of all of this. The goal is not to memorize perfect lines. The real goal is to become more genuinely curious about people. When curiosity is real, good questions become easier. And when curiosity is paired with strong listening, conversations change. Because in the end, the most important part isn't the question itself. It's what happens after the question. You can ask an average question and still create a great conversation if your listening is excellent. But even a brilliant question won't do much if you're not actually present for the answer. That's the real skill, not sounding clever, not performing warmth, not collecting conversation tricks. It's learning how to make another person feel worth discovering. And when you do that consistently, people remember you.